In this lecture, we will be discussing Charlotte Perkins Gilman's short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, that can be found in the Broadview Anthology of Short Fiction on page 73, or you can find a copy of it online as well as a PDF file that will be linked on the course homepage. So I thought we would start with a author profile for Charlotte Perkins Gilman. She was born in 1860 in Hartford, Connecticut, and a little bit of background information on how she grew up. So she was abandoned by her father and grew up in poverty. She was very much a creative person. She went against her mother's wishes and enrolled in Rhode Island School of Design to study art and painting. And it is at school where she met her future husband, Charles Walter Stetson. So she married Stetson and almost immediately gave up her vigorous intellectual life, her creativity, and this marriage, led to her depression. So the fact that she no longer had a sort of outlet for her creativity and her intellect. She fell into a depression, and this only escalated when she gave birth to their daughter in 1885. At this time, she was sent to a noted neurologist, Weir Mitchell, who is also mentioned in the short story. And Weir Mitchell was famous for his rest cure, which we'll talk about a little later, but it involved, again, pretty much just bed rest. And she was told not to continue her writing or any sort of intellectual or artistic creativity or activity. She was greatly discouraged at doing. So this led to her almost complete nervous breakdown, and we get a sense of her fictionalizing this experience in The Yellow Wallpaper, where the female protagonist of the story is driven to the brink of insanity following this experience of the rest cure as administered by her husband, John. So Perkins Gilman eventually would become a noted feminist advocate, and she would go on to write feminist novels, a utopian feminist novel called Herland. In this story, we get a glimpse at her sort of strong feminist politics, as it sort of is, the story sort of dramatizes the conflict between husband and wife when the husband is too controlling and oppressive and limits his wife's ability to create and have sort of meaningful work and meaningful expression in her life. So she's very much an oppressed figure. And in regards to Gilman's own life, she was able to cure herself following her experience of Weir Mitchell's rest cure, and it was only until she sort of became an outspoken feminist advocate that she was able to sort of recover from her bout with hysteria, mental illness, nervous depression, whatever you want to call it. So she was able to overcome and cure herself only by finding her voice through feminist discourse. So the historical context of Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Yellow Wallpaper is, again, has to do with the Victorian period, and we've already sort of talked about that a little bit in regards to Kate Chopin's The Story of an Hour. Added to that context where women were, again, oppressed and subordinated in their role as a sort of domestic, within the domestic sphere, and were expected to be subservient to their husbands and to live very much for their husbands. We have this context of psychoanalytic theory placed on top of this context, the Victorian context. So Weir Mitchell was best known for the rest cure, and this is what Gilman herself experienced when she was treated by Weir Mitchell for her depression. And it was Weir Mitchell who advised her to, quote, live as domestic a life as possible and never touch a pen, brush, pencil as long as you live. So this was the advice given to her from this well-known male doctor. And he said, avoid any sort of creative work. Put down the pen, pencil, stop writing, stop painting, stop doing anything that you enjoy, and really just live as domestic a life as possible. And the rest cure was sort of forced the patient to bed rest, isolated them in a very sort of minimalized environment with very little stimulation. And then you were sort of fed all these rich foods, cream and iron-rich beef, and there was also sort of massage. So you were very much just secluded and babied, right? So neither of these things did very much for Gilman, who wanted more stimulation and wanted to have an outlet for her creativity. And she says that this rest cure brought her to the brink of a nervous breakdown when she experienced it. So many people, many women who were the patients, hysterical patients, found this method torturous, and the monotony, the forced imprisonment also sort of ended up making their conditions worse. So women at the time were diagnosed with hysteria or depression or nervous disorders, and Gilman experienced that firsthand, and that's what she's writing about in The Yellow Wallpaper. So the history of hysteria is very fascinating, and it's one of my interests. So I know a little bit about the background information for hysteria. And in the story, the protagonist is diagnosed by her husband, who is a doctor, and he says she suffers from a temporary nervous depression, a slight hysterical tendency. So she is a hysterical patient, and women at this time were treated in various ways, and some of the ways are ridiculous, and again, we would not think of them as helpful in this day and age for a cure for depression or nervousness. But at the time, these were the sort of methods used to treat hysterical patients. And they included, in this illustration here, we have a woman who is being hosed down with cold water aimed at her uterus. It was believed that the uterus was the cause of instability in women, emotional problems, depression. And the word hysteria actually derives from the word ustera, meaning uterus. So in this case, they believed that the uterus was sort of a free-floating entity in the body, and it would travel around the body causing problems. And one of those problems was depression, so they had all manners of treatments that they prescribed for women believing their uterus was the cause of their sort of nervousness. And some of them included, I just listed some here, the use of vibrators was first used, so that's kind of a funny little piece of information, but drugs, cauterization of the cervix, so all types of sort of really invasive, experimental types of treatments were used, some more drastic and harmful than others. Hysterectomies, electroshock therapy, solitary confinement, and in this case we have hydrotherapy, which is the use of water sprayed at the female patient. So again, the science medical treatments at the time were very much experimental and not proven, and some of them did more harm than they did help the patients. So the history of hysteria is also fascinating, and in this Victorian period, hysteria was most often associated with women. Like I said, the word itself derives from the word ustera, meaning uterus or womb. And there is sort of a cultural baggage attached to the word hysteria. It still seems to be associated with women, even though we know there was no biological connection between a woman's body and then her experience of this disorder, nervousness and depression. In fact, there's more sort of ideas. These ideas still exist today if we think about how we consider, or how society sort of treats women in regards to sort of PMS and those types of things, where there's this idea that women are still sort of not in control of their emotions. They're still associated with sort of being irrational or overly emotional, weak or frail. So I think there's some baggage that still exists in regards to this idea or cultural ideas of how women are connected with feelings and emotions. And really we see that stereotype being played out in the history of hysteria. In this illustration we have a noted psychologist, this is Charcot, he was sort of a predecessor to Freud, and he would demonstrate in classrooms full of male doctors how the female patient was very sort of susceptible to his hypnosis and gave way to her irrational parts of her mind. So the female patients were more connected to the irrational, emotional side of their nature. So we get that demonstrated a little bit in the story, where we have a gender division between the male doctor, her husband, John, and then the female patient, who is nameless in the story. And then she sort of is suffering from this nervous condition, and he's sort of suppressing her her inclination to create and to write. So one of the interesting things that we can see in the history of hysteria is the fact that Charlotte Perkins Gilman was able to cure her own hysterical diagnosis by becoming an outspoken feminist figure. And in some regards, once she began writing her stories, like the Yellow Wallpaper and other novels, and started entering into the public arena as an outspoken feminist figure in politics, she was able to sort of overcome her hysterical depression. So in some regard, the hysteria that exists is connected to a sort of the restraints or oppression that existed at the time that didn't allow women to have that outlet and to experience or express themselves freely. So Perkins, like her protagonist in the Yellow Wallpaper, felt very much oppressed by her marriage and by society, and she didn't have that outlet, and this led to a mental breakdown. And in her real life, she was able to transcend that depression by writing stories such as the Yellow Wallpaper. So in real life, she was able to overcome her illness. In the story, unfortunately, our protagonist succumbs to a breakdown where she will eventually sort of make a transformation into a kind of monstrous version of herself. So we're going to focus on 4 aspects of the story and how each contributes to the protagonist's mental illness or hysteria. So we're going to look more specifically at descriptions of the room, of her illness itself, of the wallpaper, and then finally of her husband John, and how each contributes to her breakdown.